Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. You will hear from industry leaders covering innovative, cutting-edge business, learning, and HR topics that weave current market research and technology into each episode. Our Excellence at Work podcast is hosted by Brandon Hall Group's Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Thank you for tuning in to Brandon Hall Group's Excellence at Work podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. Today we're going to be talking about keeping the human connection in a hybrid learning environment, which is a follow-up to a webinar that we recently collaborated with Class Technologies. And I'd like to welcome Ben Lowell, the strategic advisor from Class. Hi, Ben, how are you?
I'm well, thank you for having me.
And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I know the webinar was fantastic, so we just want to kind of continue that discussion along and would like to share a little bit about you to our listeners and our audience. For those of you that may not know Ben, he has extensive experience in the learning and development space. He started his career as a facilitator with Fidelity Investments before moving into L&D management. And more recently, he has held customer success and sales roles at Pluralsight and Instructure before joining Class, where he now manages corporate strategy for large enterprises. So that's pretty impressive. You work with a lot of clients, and you're going to share some of your stories here today with us. And also just a little bit about Class. We recently did a podcast with another member from your team not too long ago, so it's good to have you back, or your organization back. Class is a live virtual learning platform that supports face-to-face learning at scale, enabling employees to learn with and from each other in context-rich active learning experiences. Class was founded in 2020 by education software pioneer Michael Chasen, and also Class Technologies is headquartered in Washington, D.C. However, your staff is spread out remotely throughout the world. Similar to us, we're pretty spread out too, so it's, especially in this new working environment, it gives us a lot more flexibility and options in bringing on team members from everywhere. So that's another opportunity, I think, coming out of the pandemic. Before diving into our discussion, I want to congratulate you on 3 Excellence Award wins in 2020, where you were recognized by Brandon Hall Group's analyst team and a panel of industry professionals in the learning space from Brandon Hall Group's Excellence Awards program. So congratulations. And now let's get started. I would love to hear from you, Ben, and if you could share what are some of the trends and innovations that you're seeing now, as you anticipate what you're seeing now, and what do you anticipate will stick around for the long time?
Sure. Well, I'll start with virtual classrooms. Virtual learning has been around a long time. When I was working at Fidelity Investments, it's been 15 years now since I started there, and virtual learning was just coming onto the scene. That we had a lot of remote employees in different locations, and so there was an effort to try to train a larger quantity of employees in a more effective way. And so virtual learning came on the scene, and there were a few tools that started that. And at the time, I kind of thought this would change the world, the way we learn and the way we communicate. And those tools filtered into some universities and some organizations for training and for learning and distance learning, but it didn't really, in my opinion, didn't really take hold across most organizations. It was kind of a niche tool. It became a tool for online universities and some professors. It became useful in some training instances, but I think the majority of people still were focused on in-person learning and then e-learning, asynchronous e-learning. And so I don't think it took off like I thought it would. And then, fast forward 10 years, 10, 12 years, we're in the pandemic, and companies are forced to be all remote. Everybody, employees everywhere were in their homes or you're not allowed to come into the office, and still in some instances that's the case. So the need became dire, and the use case was proven immediately. Companies shifted their method of training. They went immediately online, and for those that weren't doing it before, it was 100% transition. Others had some online presence, but now we're forced to do 100% of learning in a remote environment. So what I think now is that we're never going to go back, right? We're never going to get rid of virtual classrooms. Virtual classrooms are here to stay. Remote learning, virtual learning is here to stay. And some of the innovations that are going to follow as a result of that are exciting. So I'm curious to see what happens. One of the other changes is not just learning that's going to change, but businesses have changed the way they've changed their expectations as to where their employees live and how they work, right? So hybrid work, people who work in an office and people who work at home, and then having the option to do both, right? For the same people, that has opened up in so many businesses now. So the world that we live in from now on, I believe, will stay as a hybrid world, meaning some people will be at home, some people will be at remote offices, and some people will be in physical locations. And that will be the new nature of work for almost every company. And even companies that require people to be in person, let's say you work at a factory and you're there are stores and places you have to be at, physical locations, but those businesses will have a lot of their administrative staff who will have the option to be remote. Right. So anyways, that's something really interesting, and that the nature of work today will just continue to spur innovation coming forward.
Yeah, and if you think about even some industries that you never thought that could possibly be remote, like banking, for instance, you hardly have any tellers when you go there. Everything's automated and self instruction. You go to stores, there you have a lot of self checkouts now, even at the grocery store. Even healthcare. If you need to, you can pre-schedule a televisit or radiology. A lot of that is now done tele or virtual. So obviously there's going to be certain things that you cannot replace from having to be there. But I think that gives people a lot more options too, depending on what you like and what works for you and your phase of your life. If you have more options, where you're not stuck or constrained to being in an office, if that's not really feasible for your lifestyle, depending on, what makes sense for you. So I think it opens up a lot more doors for everyone. And different styles. Some people like being in an office, some people don't. Some people, like to have a little bit of both. So I think that lends itself a lot of, opportunities for everyone. And talking about opportunities, from what you see, how has this impacted the learning culture?
Most of all, again, I think it forced leaders, especially executive leaders who have been around a while, to see the validity of virtual learning. It's not only doable, but it, in many cases, is better economically, it's more feasible, and it's easier to scale across a large organization. So I think leadership have now fully bought into that concept across most companies that we've worked with. It's not just learning leaders that are kind of on the fringe of saying like, hey, we should do more remote learning. A lot of the leaders, the business leaders, are saying we want to continue remote learning because it's easier to scale. That doesn't mean that replaces all instances of in-person learning. What I see going forward is there will continue to be a blended modality where you have the option to scale learning faster in a virtual environment, and then reserve those in-person learning opportunities for really critical times and moments. So you save money, you save time, you save a lot of productivity hours if you really plan around when it's critical to be in person and when we can do a lot of things in a remote setting.
And planning is important because it still takes a lot of strategy and thinking to create these experiences where they're meaningful and they're impactful. So by doing virtual doesn't take away from the experience necessarily, but I think for a learning leader, they really have to think about their audience. What are they providing to them? Where are the gaps? So a lot of the things that we've done before in assessing what the learning needs are still very relevant. I think the way that it's being delivered and that mix of modalities has changed, and technology is, you cannot, you have to have good technology, and you have to have a good process in place for this to be able to work well. And from from what you see, what are some of the technologies that are beneficial in helping encourage peer learning, community, coaching, performance?
Yeah, there's quite a few. I think first and foremost, you have a broad range of communication tools. You've got instant messaging tools. You have Slack and Jabber and dozens of others. You've got web conferencing tools, Zoom, Teams, GoToMeeting, right? All these, and then Class, of course, kind of fits into that in a different way. And then you have other tools that can support learning that isn't all in person at the same time. So any asynchronous learning activities. But with all those tools combined, you can have a lot of organic experiences in learning. For example, you can have a new hire cohort group, right? You've got 20 new hires at your company, and they're all spread out across a very broad region. So it could be global. Our company is 100% remote, right? Which opens up the doors to hire anybody from anywhere, really. I mean, we have a lot of opportunities for hiring and bringing in diverse talent, diversity of experience, just as much as other diversity, right? So bringing in people from all over the world to help, build this product. And so if you have a group of 20 new hires at our company or other companies that are remote, they're not going to be physically present very often. So how are you going to make sure that they feel connected to their team? How that they feel they're supported? That can be a challenge. And so the more opportunities we have to connect in real ways, the better that becomes. That experience can be enhanced. And you're right. You said that the old strategies of designing learning haven't really changed. I think you just have to be way more intentional. So as a live facilitator, when I was in a training room with a bunch of people, I had the luxury of seeing them face to face and seeing what they were doing. And I could read body language really well, and I could see if people were getting tired or they were losing focus. It was very easy to monitor that at a small scale. If you get beyond 20 people though, in a physical space, it started to become really challenging. Like 20 was usually my max, but you get 30, 40, 50, 60 people in a room, it's much harder to manage their learning and making sure that everybody's on track and still staying focused. Mm-hmm. That amplifies in a virtual setting. It's much harder to make sure you're gauging their levels of interest and interactivity and engagement in a virtual setting, because I can't see what they're doing with their computer or their phone, or if they have a virtual background, I can't see what they're doing, or sometimes their camera's off entirely, so I don't even see their face. Right? I can't even read body language. So it becomes extremely challenging to track real-time engagement of your participants in a virtual room. And so that's why it's so much more important that you're very intentional and strategic around the way you design the learning. I used to teach junior high students, mm-hmm. and I would change up activities every 5 to 7 minutes. We were doing something different that frequently. And in my experience, adults really aren't that much different when it comes to staying focused and being, paying attention. And so I love to change something up every 5 to 7 minutes in the way that I'm delivering content and the way that a training is structured. And so it just goes back to you have to be really good at your design, and ultimately the software doesn't solve your problem. Mm-hmm. If you have you can have really bad training in person, and you can have that really bad training experience in a virtual setting.
Very true.
But if you have a good strategy going in, and you have really smart people who have figured this out, those in-person experiences and those virtual experiences will be great. And now we add in the level of technology that will enhance that. But just by virtue of having technology, that doesn't solve your problems. You have to be really intentional around the design and how you use those technologies to further the learning needs of your audience.
And we see if you're, starting with either converting some of your content into virtual learning or different types of technology, or if you're creating, new content, I think it's really important to start with small pieces, as you mentioned, how you taught middle school and you were changing it, and then get feedback and get their reaction sooner than later. One is really important to gather the metrics, throughout rather than at the end, because then depending on how long that content or how long that training is, you may have wasted a lot of time in building or converting it, and it wasn't connecting to your audience. So the more you can vet it and get feedback, at the very beginning, then you can make course corrections if needed, sooner than later.
Definitely, yeah. Iterating is a critical component, and in the virtual space, it actually is forcing facilitators to be more strategic and be more thoughtful about the way they design learning. I've been in way too many training sessions and classes when I was in college too, where we'd sit for an hour and somebody would just talk to us for an hour, and it's a very miserable learning experience in most settings. I don't care how engaging the speaker is. I mean, it could be the President of the United States, it could be a Nobel Prize winner, and an hour is a long time for anybody to focus on just speaking. And so if you've got training materials where you would sit there for an hour and just, death by PowerPoint show that, that was not a good experience in the physical space, and it's even worse in the virtual space. So the concept of flipping the classroom has been around for a long time now. This really works in the virtual space. And the reason I say that is because that lecture that you gave for an hour, you could easily record that, send it out to people, and they could all watch it at their own pace, at their own time, and you could give them a quiz or some form of, follow-up that they're required to do to make sure they capture that information.
Right.
What I would do, instead of having them do that all in person and waste everybody's time for an hour and really not get good engagement and good outcomes, learning outcomes, is I would send that out in a different format, let everybody consume it at their own pace, and then I would bring everybody together after to discuss it, right? Especially if, let's say there's a compliance topic that sometimes they're just so dry, they're hard to make exciting and interesting. So if you send out, an HR topic like that, 30 minutes, hour presentation, people watch it, they have to answer some questions, and then they come together as leaders and discuss how does this actually work in the real world, like what is the application policy? Now we're going to create learning opportunities for the leaders who are in that room. And if you mix it up with experienced leaders and some lesser experienced leaders, they're going to have some cross-pollination of experiences and really learn from each other and learn from the dialogue and conversation. And that can happen in a physical space, or it could happen virtually if it's done right. And it will have a much more improved learning outcome than you would see if you were just saying, okay, everybody watch us all present this hour-long PowerPoint and not talk, it's hard.
Right. Well, that's a really good example of, because I think too, right now people struggle with, what do you make live? What do you make self-paced? And, how do you, how does that look? So I think a lot of learning leaders are struggling with trying to figure out that formula and ensuring that their people are, if it's mandated or if it's compliance, that they have the proper training, whether it's to support their recertifications or just, their compliance, depending on the industry. So I think that, I think you kind of constructed or reconstructed in a way, think about what you're delivering. And it's kind of like, I remember maybe 10, 12 years ago when we were thinking about, building in-house and outsourcing, what do you build in-house? You kind of have that box, what was it, and you had kind of in that right quadrant, things that were proprietary, or that was your secret sauce. So those
Yeah.
are some things that you need to think about. You can't just buy off-the-shelf content and make that work. So kind of like similar here, if you kind of think about, what is it that's critical that you need to make sure that you're talking about or collaborating and reinforcing, that's something that you need to, whether it's virtual live or in-person live, you need to kind of reinforce that. And then the other things that require, memorizing or just learning or there's so many things, but
Right.
you really kind of have to think about that and then revisit what that looks like over time.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. There's a lot definitely, but I do think too with the virtual aspect to it, it's so much easier to be able to adapt your content or make changes. When you're live, let's say you're invested in this 2-day workshop, you have your, it's so much harder to make those changes or a week-long program if you had to, rather than you're working with them in a 3 to 4 weeks time frame and you're giving them chunks of information and then you're like, I don't know, that didn't resonate. Maybe we should flip it around the next, presentation.
Right. Yeah, you have the luxury of doing that. And,
Mhm.
sometimes we forget that at least in my experience as a learner, my most memorable, opportunities for me to learn were when I was in a group of people and I had some ideas of what I was hoping to get out of the content or the material, and I had kind of planned, this is what I want to do. And the facilitator had created a space where learning could happen, as opposed to thinking that the facilitator was the teacher and was going to teach everything to everybody so everybody was fully understood. It was creating an environment where learning can occur and that discovery process is possible. And so then I would go in as a learner and I would listen for things that I was interested in, and I would focus on things that I knew I needed to work on. And as a result of the environment, the people that are around me, the opportunities, and the things that I was hearing, I would learn something very impactful for myself. It was a self-discovery process, and the learning is really solidified when it's self-propelled, right?
Sure.
When I stumble upon something that I just find revolutionary for me, that's going to stick with me and it's going to impact me way more than anything that somebody else can give me or show me.
Sure.
Right? Self-discovery, I think, is the top tier of actual learning that changes and impacts behavior. And so I think that if facilitators are focused on how do we create an environment where people can learn for themselves, can find that and discover the excitement behind it and really grow, that's where you're winning. And it's a lot less presentation. And a lot of times the facilitator is just not talking a lot. A lot of times the facilitator needs to get out of the way.
Right. Asking questions and,
Yeah, the Socratic method is so valuable in that space because it allows people to ponder, to consider, and to really evaluate what they need to learn, and two, how it's going to change their behavior. And so as opposed to thinking like, this is the learning outcome I want everybody to walk away with, which sometimes I know is necessary, like everybody needs to understand this one thing, I get that. But I think a more important and maybe a more elevated status for learning is, how do I create an environment where people will learn what they need to know? So the learning outcomes for everybody is slightly different, right? Especially when we're talking about training people skills and human skills. Like there's not a definitive answer for how to handle certain situations every single time. So it's really about individual growth in those settings, as opposed to, well, we need to learn this. Now, if we're training hard skills, I used to work at Pluralsight, and the focus was, we're training engineers, we're training IT administrators, we're training, AWS administrators, and anybody that's like, there are some very specific skills that you can learn, and there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. But when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about delivering and developing human skills, those soft skills we talk about. You really have to change that modality quite a bit and allow people to self-discover, because everybody comes in with different gaps in their abilities. And so what they're going to walk away with should be different, right?
Right.
Yeah. So as a facilitator, it's really difficult for you to know what everybody needs to walk away with. So it's better to formulate an environment where they can learn and self-discover, and then they're going to get what they absolutely needed as opposed to what I think they should get out of it.
Sure. And as we wrap up today, is that what is the best advice? It sounds like you just shared quite a bit here of what we should be thinking about. Is there anything else that you would offer a learning leader today to succeed in our environment?
Yeah, I'll read off maybe like 3 things. First of all, software won't solve your problems. I work for a software company. It sounds counterintuitive, but the software will not solve everything. You need intelligent people, you need really good strategy, and then you need software to support those strategies and those people. So keep that in mind. Make sure that your people are adequately trained. We talk about training business, but a lot of times we forget about training our learning leaders. They need the training as well. They need to continue to upskill. They need to continue to adapt. Again, in teaching junior high, I saw this a lot where there were certain teachers that were just, they taught the same way for 30 years. And they never adapted their style at all. That's not good, especially in the way that our environment is changing. The technique there is, don't expect your learners to adapt to your style. You're the learning expert. You need to be able to adapt to your learners.
Mm-hmm. And
maybe
it's
that's
changing.
the final piece. Yeah, it changes. It constantly is shifting. So you can't just say, this is the way I teach. If you don't like it, tough. Like you're the learning professional.
That 20 years ago, but not today.
No, it doesn't work today. People check out. I'm like, listen, I'm not interested. So the best thing for facilitators.
20 years ago, we suffered.
Yeah, no, we've been through those. Yeah, we know those professors. We know those facilitators. So the best advice I can give is continue to learn, continue to develop your skills. And in the virtual space, you have a great opportunity to learn new skills and techniques, or refine those former skills and techniques so that they translate more effectively into the virtual classroom. Because honestly, I've had some really effective trainings in the virtual space.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying it's the only answer, but I am saying that the virtual learning experience does not need to be a lesser than experience. Mm-hmm. Virtual learning and physical in-person learning can be just as effective as long as they're developed correctly with good people and good strategy. So
we believe that as well. And that was one of the reasons why we created our certification programs during the pandemic, was to help apply our research and to help create an environment where in a virtual world, and have the support, but also be as agile depending on where they are and what their needs are. And so as we've had some organizations complete the certifications, we've heard a lot of great feedback about just what you said. It's just as rich and robust as being in person, and better because they're in different geographies. You're bringing together people from India and the UK and the US, where they would not have been able to do that in a year time frame and keep coming together. So things like what you do and what we do, and other our clients and what they're working on, I think it's there's a lot to be said in how they leverage it and how beneficial it can be. But I love your advice. I think you're dead on with, need intelligent people. You need leaders that are going to be able to reflect on themselves and be able to assess who their audience is and how they want to learn. And so having that ability to do that it'll give them, it'll help them succeed.
Certainly. Yep.
So Ben, thank you. Thanks so much for joining me today and for sharing your expertise. And thank you everyone for also joining us. And I hope that you found our talk today interesting and helpful, even if you walked away with a few key insights here to help motivate you to be the best you can be. That's what we're here for.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel. It was a pleasure.